the study by Jean Twenge, 2010 study. Her research group found that using MMPI scales, the depression, anxiety, narcissism, antisociality, and other indicators of mental illness rose dramatically from the 1930s to the 2000s. Let me read you a quote here. She says here that as American culture increasingly valued extrinsic self-centered goals like money, status, while increasingly devaluing community, affiliation, and finding meaning in life, the mental health of American youth has suffered. Interventions, she argues, must work against American cultural values such as materialism, but the benefit may be the improved youth mental health. This is just one of many of the studies that I talk about in my upcoming book, A Jungian Analysis of Toxic Modern Society. It's not upcoming, it's available now. Links in the description. The analysis here furthermore investigated what the social cultural factors were that actually influenced the generational increase of depression and anxiety that we've seen in other videos. Some of it involves the social instincts, as I've already mentioned. Their evidence draws from a number of studies that show that people who pursue extrinsic goals like money, looks, and status tend to be more anxious and depressed compared to those who pursue intrinsic goals like competence, affiliation, i.e. belonging to a social group, and stable interpersonal connection. So that's worth repeating, right? So the shift between the value system of money, looks, and status to from intrinsic goals, competence, affiliation, and stable interpersonal connection, that came at a cost. And that cost is worsening mental health. Not a huge shock, really, but maybe now that it's in these studies here, it's a little bit more clear. Anyway, coinciding with this, surveys showed that young Americans have continued to increasingly pursue extrinsic goals since they were first studied back in the 1970s. And supporting this shift that it had already been changing from before that is the sharp decline in community involvement that we saw in the 60s. From the 30s, it had actually increased. But then when the 60s came, you saw a huge drop. Now, any of you familiar with literature searches and studying different scientific experiments and so forth are probably saying, okay, yeah, but what about other possible explanations here? What about reporting bias, right? That's always the first one people mention. What about economic causes for depression, so forth and so on? Twenge, without getting too deep in the weeds here, was able to rule those out or at least account for them enough to suggest a pretty strong correlation that had a causal link. And in other words, what she found and what the other studies that I go over in the book found is that we're more depressed and anxious, in large part because our culture has become increasingly narcissistic. That's also found in other studies as well, and the narcissism has been increasing as well. So along with these changes, we've seen more narcissism, more consumer-driven culture, uninterested in affiliation or participation in favor of increasing individualism, materialism, superficial self-aggrandizement. Now, I talk about hyper-individualism in a previous video, and this is just one more piece of that. What was the price for this increase in preoccupation with material gain? It may have been an overall goal of meaningfulness in life, which has declined since the 60s. In 2006, according to Pryor et al., when reported in 2007, Twenge et al. Point out that along with the rising rates of depression and anxiety, we also have seen a cultural shift in emphasis from encouraging young people to seek out community building, competence, and stable social reputation over other things, money, power, physical beauty. And with this shift has come a corresponding rise in depression, anxiety, self-harm, and addictions. So it looks like what we're talking about then is an overall increase in generally narcissistic traits. Interestingly enough, this has actually been studied as well. There's a number of papers and experiments on this. And it does seem to be a part of the overall contributing worsening mental health that I've been discussing on this channel. And In fact, those shifts, those cultural shifts, are associated with it, emphasizing self-aggrandizement over social connection. In a Target article in 2012 by Joel Paris, the changing appearance of narcissistic traits was discussed. And Paris found that cultural elements appeared to be correlating with the rising prevalence of narcissistic traits found in studied populations in the US. One interesting example of this is the changes in song lyrics, particularly after 2000, where they saw a shift in the lyrics focusing on narcissistic themes, interestingly enough. So it's the culture is reflecting the artwork is the music is reflecting the cultural shifts, using the term art loosely. And another Twenge study of 2010 showed that changing parenting practices seemed to influence the levels of narcissism, including increased permissiveness, overindulgence, promotion of self-esteem, independent of accomplishment. This is your classic old man, shaking his fist at the cloud kind of stuff, but it does seem like it's got some backing here. In a 2001 study by Dervasula, samples from the US, New Zealand, India, and China were compared for the rate of concern over personal appearance and achievements. And they found the US and New Zealand scored higher, big shock, but that agrees with the later findings in 2003, that there were more narcissistic traits found in the US than in Asia or in the Middle East. Paris argues that it is modernity itself, post-industrialism, and cultural changes from traditional societies is associated with the greater focus on individual feelings at the expense of focus on conforming to external expectations. Conforming is a bad word in our cultures. This trade-off, though, results in a weakening of family and community roots, and that's accelerated by increased economic and geographic mobility. This allows for greater freedom to focus on individual wants and desires, but at the cost of a reduced buffer against stressors that you would have if you had your social network fully fleshed out around you. As the weakened and thinned community buffer is less able to provide for connection, belonging, meaning, and things like that, the traditional societies are much better equipped to handle and provide. Price ends his article with asking whether or not the surge in individualism may eventually shade into narcissism, which I think we're seeing as a result. He puts it this way: narcissism is hardly a new historical phenomenon. No collectivist traditional society has ever been described. No purely collectivist traditional society has ever been described. In every historical period, ambitious people have indulged in self-display and sought fame and attention. No surprise there. But what is unique about modern societies is that they promote values that encourage narcissism in everyone, not just the elite. I think it's a pretty interesting quote there and pretty telling. Another aspect of this is that in many traditional societies, those who indulge in self-display and seek out fame and attention are often ridiculed rather than held up as paragons of virtue, or at least paragons of what we should be wanting. If you think about TV shows like Kardashians and all that kind of thing that glamorizes, extreme narcissistic behavior. The turning point in our society seems to have been around 1900. This, again, it's coming from Price's in-depth analysis of this, where you had an overall shift in cultural mores that went towards seeking fame, celebrity, and money as opposed to duty, honor, and service. There was another commentary by a political philosopher, Emitzai Etzioni, in 93, who felt that the inherently atomizing culture of Western nations forced us into a dismissal of the natural need for social connection and belonging. Again, we see the point made that our social connections, which I'm calling social instincts, are neglected, with the suffering being the result, no matter how we may wish to explain it away or ignore it. So what we're seeing here is the changing cultural landscape that has fostered an increase in individualism have come with very high levels of narcissism. And this, in turn, is shifting us towards worsening depression and anxiety. Something to think about. Something to think about. Anything that you can do, I think, to contribute to a shift in these mores. It would require a culture-wide shift, of course, but what we can all do is control our little tiny corner of the universe and try to focus more on those things. Interestingly enough, you can make even a utilitarian argument for it. Like we're happier when we're doing that anyway, rather than seeking endless, more money, more fame, more looks, more all that stuff. Our economy and our economic system basically thrives on that kind of culture, but it's making us sick. It's making us mentally ill. So that's your Mental Health Monday for today. Make sure you subscribe if you like that. Click the like button. You can also check out ericgoodwyn.com. I've got podcasts and other stuff there you can't get here. And until then, I'll see you next time.